Just giving everyone a second to stream in here. Okay, great. Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Shao, and I'm the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our discussion on critical race theory in the classroom. As bills to ban critical race theory, or CRT for short, become law in states ranging from New Hampshire to Texas, and school boards across the country tackle the difficult question of race education in the classroom, CRT has become a critical fault line for America's political and cultural debates. Battles over whether 1619 or 1776 was a true American founding have come to animate parents, teachers, and activists from all backgrounds and walks of life. For this reason, we are fortunate to have all three perspectives with us today to talk about the impact of CRT on the American educational system. Before I introduce our guests for this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our nearly 400 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the cultivation and creation of new knowledge is key, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now on to our guests. Christopher F. Rufo is a senior fellow and the director of the Initiative on Critical Race Theory at the Manhattan Institute. He's also contributing editor at the City Journal and the founder and director of Battlefront, a public policy research center that also serves as an aggregator for his investigative journalism and filmmaking work. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and a former Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. Andrew Gottman joined the nationwide movement fighting for classical liberal values and against critical race theory in schools when the letter he wrote to the parents of his daughter's New York City private school, the Brearley School, went viral. Since then, he's become an activist in this movement, writing about the issue, speaking to parent groups, and founding the organization Speak Up for Education and co-founding the Institute for Liberal Values. Mr. Gottman is also a former investment banker, software engineer, entrepreneur, and the author of the book, How to Be an Investment Banker. And last but not least, Paul Rossi is a high school mathematics teacher, tutor, and writer. His essay, I Refuse to Stand By While My Students Are Indoctrinated, describes the impact of critical race theory and pedagogy on his students at Grace Church School, where he had been teaching since 2012. Since his publication and his departure from the school, Mr. Rossi has discussed his experiences on several podcasts, including the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, the Megyn Kelly Show, and the Fifth Column. Mr. Rossi graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in French Literature from Cornell in 1992, and with a Master's of Arts in Educational Psychology at Hunter College in 2010. For the format of this panel, we'll have each of our guests deliver brief opening remarks on their experiences with critical race theory and the current debate happening at school boards and state legislatures across the country. Afterwards, I'll ask a few questions, and finally, we'll have questions from our audience, which you can submit throughout the event using the Q&A feature on the lower panel of the Zoom window. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Rufo, Andrew Gottman, and Paul Rossi virtually to Yale and to the Buckley program. Now we'll begin with Christopher Rufo's comments.
Great, yeah, I just like to open, I'm assuming all of you that are listening have some background knowledge about this, so I won't give the ABCs, but I think I'd like to maybe start by dispelling a couple myths about what this debate is not about. One of the things that you mentioned in your intro is the value of a kind of freewheeling and open debate where all perspectives are entertained, valued, and discussed. And I think that it's important to know that CRT, we're talking really specifically K through 12. And when you're talking about K through 12, especially public K through 12, a couple things don't apply that I see happening in a lot of the rhetoric on the left, but also on the center right. First off, public K-12 schools are not a free marketplace of ideas. They're not actually a free marketplace of any kind. In fact, public schools are a state-run, taxpayer-funded monopoly that crowds out almost every other alternative. You have 90+% of American school kids are in public institutions, and therefore they're not really a marketplace of any kind. It's really a kind of state-run monopoly or cartel, if you have the kind of aggregating different school districts. The second thing that I think is important is that in public schools, all perspectives are not entertained. I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that if the public is financing the institution, the public gets to decide which values that institution transmits. And because children are in public schools for roughly 10,000 hours over their K through 12 career, it's a limited time, and therefore you, by necessity, limit certain perspectives. You don't teach flat earthism. You don't teach, speaking in tongues from a, Pentecostal perspective. There are certain things because of the limitations of time that you don't teach, and also the limitations of what the public wants to transmit. And therefore, and then third and finally, when you're talking about kids, kids, especially at the lower grade levels, are not equipped to entertain all perspectives. As a parent or as a teacher, an educator, you have to be able to discern what is appropriate for that age level, because kids are vulnerable, they're impressionable, you are really kind of have a responsibility to take greater care than in, for example, a college class where you could discuss things very widely. So I think those three things are really important when we're talking about critical race theory, especially when we're talking about legislation to stop critical race theory indoctrination, not discussion, but actual teaching a hotly contested and debatable point of view, not as one of many perspectives, but as a truth that has to be affirmed or accepted by students. So I hope that's helpful to kind of start it off. And then I know Andrew and Paul can talk a little bit more about the impact on the classroom and other ideas about reforming.
Yeah, let me go ahead. Okay, I'm Andrew Gottman. I'll just tell my little story, and then I'll follow up a little bit on what Christopher Rufo said. But I was just a dad in New York City. My daughter was in 6th grade at a prestigious K through 12 all-girls private school. And after the events of George Floyd and BLM last summer, is when sort of the light switch went off, and the mission of the school really changed from being traditionally what a school is supposed to do, which is to teach kids, to indoctrinating them, as Chris said, and training what we now sort of call activists or social justice warriors. And we saw what was happening with the school, how this was CRT, what is now called CRT. It wasn't that well known at that point when this happened back in April. The school called it their anti-racism initiatives or their DEI initiative. Now we sort of call it under the umbrella, thanks to Chris more than anybody else, of CRT. But we saw the direction of the school. We saw how this was being incorporated into every class, every aspect of the curriculum, this obsession with race. And it was more than just race, about sexuality, age and appropriate discussions of gender and sexuality, but more than anything else, also about race. And we communicated our unhappiness to the administration and got absolutely nowhere. We communicated with a lot of other parents of the school that we knew. And I am very confident in when I said this then, and I say this now, which is more than half of the parents, I believe, were very unhappy as we were with the direction of the school, but we could not get people to speak up. And that's something I don't know if we'll touch on a little bit later, how the private school fight is very different than the public school fight in CRT. So we couldn't get parents to speak up. We couldn't get anywhere with the administration. And when we decided not to re-enroll our daughter in the spring in about March of last year, we said, listen, someone's got to do something. And we've got to try to get parents to speak up here. This institution is being destroyed. The education of our children, I think, is being destroyed. This is damaging, not for just my daughter, not for just these children, but for New York City and ultimately for the country. And So I sent a letter with the hopes to all the parents of my daughter's school with the hopes that it would spur parents to speak up. And I had never had any idea that this would go viral. I never had any idea that this would really be read by any more than the parents that I sent it to. Maybe it would get picked up in sort of the gossipy New York City press that likes to talk about these fancy, private, expensive schools. But it did, it went viral. And I started to get outreach from people all across the country. And again, like I said earlier, because CRT was not yet really in the news in a big way, it was not really yet at that point a big political issue. I personally, and I think a lot of people have said the same thing, had no idea how entrenched, how widespread CRT had become across America. We knew because there was a little bit of reporting on it. This was in fancy New York City schools, private schools. We knew this was in some California fancy private schools. I had no idea that this was in private schools all across the country, in public schools all across the country, in religious and parochial schools. Had no idea how quickly this had gotten entrenched into our education system. And as Kevin said in the introduction, I've spent the last few months talking to parents and parent groups and working with a number of organizations that are trying to fight this. And this is absolutely a fight. And it's a fight that we have to have. This is a fight over the education of our children, but much more than that, because CRT is really just a symptom of much broader sort of illiberalism, things that go against the founding principles of this country, against ideas like freedom of speech and freedom of thought and diversity of thought. And as parents, but as students, as citizens, we've got to fight this. So I'll stop there, give it up to Paul.
I'm Paul Rossi. I till very recently taught at a private school in Manhattan, and I saw much of the same things that Andrew saw, but from within the school community, the school environment, the classroom environment, and the types of teachings that had become increasingly, I think, disturbing and psychologically pressuring for myself and many of my colleagues and the kids as well. I got in trouble. I guess my inciting incident was that at a racially segregated Zoom meeting in front of 200 students and about 40 or 50 of my colleagues, all considered to white identified. I asked a question that I continue to ask that raised a sort of a firestorm within the school, which was the question was, to what extent must I identify as a category that has been a social label, or that as society sees me? And a series of things ensued, and basically I refused to recant. I was asked to apologize for questioning the foundation of critical race theory praxis as it was promulgated in the school. And since I left, I've been interested in the psychology of how the CRT praxis is applied upon children as young as kindergarten, and exactly what that pedagogy is. And so I found that really identity is the cornerstone of the sophistry, and essentially that is what I'm focused on, trying to understand how they're achieving those goals, and then from that trying to find effective ways for individuals to interrupt the process, either singly or in groups, to maintain the cognitive liberty of children and their right to question these beliefs that are being represented as knowledge. So, to that end, I've been delving into the pedagogy, which involves pushing skin color categories on children in kindergarten, the use of identity wheels, where children's sense of themselves are migrated from the personal to the socially imposed identity. And really what these programs are doing is they're creating an environment that is incentivizing racial identification for students to pursue extracurricular activities or activities within the school so that they can put them on their applications, and that those applications are better received by the colleges they apply to. So it really is a kind of a vertically integrated system. And in the process of looking into that, I've learned so much about the National Association of Independent Schools and how the DEI consultancies work within that context, and the conferences that are held for the students, and the mentor-protege relationships, the talent outreach firms, and my experience is in private schools mostly, but I've heard a lot from public school parents and students as well. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion and shedding the light I can on the questions.
Great. One thing I just wanted to begin with the three of you is kind of there's been a lot of crosstalk in the media about what CRT is, what is this theory, what is this pedagogy? And I wanted to ask you, beginning with you, Mr. Rossi, and then all of you, what does CRT look like when you're teaching in the classroom? I know that you talked about a couple of beliefs that were being presented as knowledge, Mr. Rossi, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what those entail.
Well, there's the specific thing that I got in trouble for questioning was something that I'm sure that Chris could speak to as well. It was the characteristics of white supremacy, which is one of the most widely used pedagogical tools, where categories such as individualism and objectivity, a right to comfort, are all characterized as white. And really, this has if I had known at the time how bogus the scholarship was around this particular set of beliefs, I would have questioned it more and more aggressively. Only later did I find out that this is something that was cooked up 20 years ago by someone without any basis in anything other than their own lived experience, or what is called autoethnography in the scholarship. And there have been basically no experiments about it and no validity to it. It's simply cognitive bias and idea laundering, which has spread these ideas. And that's what I mean. That's a good example of representing beliefs as knowledge through false scholarship.
Gotcha,
there are other things too. There are other instruments, they call it, of the anti-racist or DEI programming. There's another famous one. I'm sure many of the students here at Yale have seen it. It's the pyramid of white supremacy, or the pyramid of racism, which includes many, I think many virtues on it, frankly, that are being misrepresented as racist, as well as some Republican Party positions. So it's extremely slanted politically. So those are a couple examples.
Mr. Ruffo, would you agree with Mr. Rossi's definition of that? Is there anything you would add to what CRT actually looks like on the ground?
Yeah, I think that's right and accurate. I would just add that I think CRT, I think its strength and its weakness, frankly, is that it maintains a kind of purposely amorphous and constantly evolving set of assumptions and ideas and theories and attitudes and claims. And it starts off, even according to their own literature, that the goal of critical race theory is not to pursue truth, but to change the world. So they're not truth-seeking, they're seeking kind of activist change and a dialectical change. And one of the games that they play is that they pretend now that we've kind of caught them and we've exposed them and we've publicized what they're doing, they make this really false distinction between theory and praxis, or theory and practice. But like any critical theory, which is a kind of neo-Marxist in origin, follows the basic idea that there is theory, so the kind of an approach of asking questions, trying to understand the world, right? A traditional theory would seek understanding, a critical theory would seek change. And in order to seek change, you have to actually implement praxis, and then the results of that praxis or experimentation feed back into your theory. So theory and practice are two sides of the same coin, but when they're kind of pushed on this, when you say, hey, wait a minute, why are we engaging in the practice of separating kids into separate classrooms by race? Or why are we claiming that, all white people inherently in their whiteness or their spiritual essence, racist and oppressive and bad? They'll say, well, some people are teaching that that's not real critical race theory. They'll kind of default back onto the theory. So I think it's important to understand that it's not a theory that's designed to understand the world. It's a theory that is designed to be applied as politics. And where they've been most successful is first in law schools, so graduate level education, then in universities, many different departments in universities, and then finally in K through 12. And one of the kind of founding figures, Richard Delgado of critical race theory, admits in an interview, said, we never intended to, quote, colonize education, to colonize K through 12 schools, but that's what they ended up doing. And it's pretty interesting as you actually go back into their own literature, their own interviews over a long period of time, before they were really under the spotlight. They lay out very clearly their agenda. They lay out really clearly their intellectual lineage. They lay out very clearly their political goals. And I think that we should believe them, believe their original work, believe when they think no one is looking, rather than these kind of word games and shell games that they've been playing the last year.
Mr. Gottman, I wanted to ask you, because I read your letter to Braley School parents, and I was curious, there are many of the teachings that have been mentioned as CRT previously in this panel are teachings that I've seen in the classroom, whether at Yale or other colleges, universities. But what does it look like to your daughter? What does it look like in the K through 12 private education realm?
Well, the first answer is we don't, as parents, really know exactly. Paul could speak to this better because the schools are so non-transparent about what they're teaching. They really try to hide this, and to some extent. And a lot of the reason that parents are finally aware of what is going on, and many parents say the same thing, is because they overheard some of this stuff on their kids' Zoom school since they were remote for the last year. I'll give an example. My daughter had, the first day of English class last year had to do the typical, I think they call it, or the intersectionality survey. Are you the victim? Are you the oppressor? So, what is your race? What is your gender? What is your sexual orientation? Which again, I think is something for a middle school age kid that really shouldn't be asked. And then you're bucketed. You're either the victim, you're the oppressor. So that's the one example. I'm looking at the chat of people asking questions. I'll give one more example of my daughter, which is not even race, and then I'll answer somebody's question, which is, one of the things that struck me, she came home, or I came home from work, and she said, what we learned today in school? We learned you never hold the door open for someone disabled, because that is a microaggression. So that's technically not maybe CRT, but CRT has sort of become sort of synonymous, for better or for worse, with sort of this whole genre of education. You're thinking to yourself, is this really the world we want to live in, that the schools are teaching that you should never hold the door open for someone disabled, because that is a microaggression? That is the kind of thing that they are teaching. Someone asked, can you give an example in kindergarten? And I have one that a kindergarten parent, the mother of in my daughter's school, had told me, which is in kindergarten, when my daughter was in kindergarten, they had a little empty silhouette of their body. And they were in our class, or just in kindergarten, they were told to, draw yourself and draw anything that you want. Draw your hair the way you want, draw your freckles, draw your glasses, whatever you want to draw, represent yourself. Well, that same exercise this year, they were given only skin-colored crayons, and were told the only thing that matters that you draw is to get your skin color right. Now, what does the school say? What does the art department say? They say, well, look, that's just an exercise in color blending. We've always done exercises in color blending. Yeah, but if they had ever done that, previous to this movement, of said, okay, the only thing you care about is your skin color, parents and frankly educators would have been up in arms. That's the kind of thing. Is that we put all white kids in a corner and whip them? No, that's not that. But it just is an example of the kind of stuff that has become pervasive throughout the entire curriculum, starting in kindergarten, all the way up through 12th grade, obviously, and then universities and beyond.
Great.
Yeah, to play devil's advocate to that, I want to sort of show the perspective of what's driving these kind of activities, because it sounds bizarre, but really their point of view is that society is already racialized in it, and that kids as young as 6 months old already start to see race as a significant category. So their perspective would be to kind of that they're actually trying to undo it by making the kids aware and conscious of their biases. I haven't looked into that scholarship, but I really don't think that it's if it's like the other scholarship I've seen. I don't know, Chris, have you seen that scholarship around that, the 6-month-old racialization of children that they claim is already happening?
Yeah, I've read some of the papers, not necessarily my field of expertise, but it's pretty slim, and they're making a huge leap in my view, where they're saying that as they've tested like faces, so they have a 3-month-old or a 6-month-old baby, and then they test them against a series of faces to see which faces they respond kind of more openly or more warmly or more positively towards. And they found that, a white baby will respond to a white woman's face more positively than someone of a different skin tone or complexion, which is, I mean, you could say, well, that baby is racist or biased against people of color or whatnot, but it's really simple. A baby is kind of trained to show some greater affiliation towards a mother, towards family members, and that is kind of a survival mechanism that doesn't actually kind of comprise or reveal any bias or certainly any racism. And then there's things that they say when they get to 4, 5, 6 years old that only white children are actually racist or racially biased. And this is because we live in a white normative and white supremacist society. That's the kind of theory that they're taking to. But I don't know. I mean, it seems silly to me just offhand. And I think, one thing that might be helpful too is there's a question in the chat about, well, what does this look like in the classroom? And, I've reported on a wide range of these stories. You can look up the reporting that I've done, but a lot of the times what they do is they try to take these theoretical categories, oppressor and oppressed, based on the various identity categories, and then actually have children, in some cases as young as kindergarten or first grade, second grade, third grade, deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and then rank themselves according in their own minds, and then according to in comparison with their classmates of where they would fit in on a racial or sexual hierarchy. And then they have different kind of lessons and takeaways for the different kids, and accordingly. And especially at that age, I mean, it seems completely crazy, but you have prestigious institutions, including Columbia Teachers College in New York, that are all behind this, that are now disseminating these programs to elementary schools and school districts across the country.
I just want to take a second to remind everyone in the audience that you can submit questions via the Q&A button on the bottom right of your Zoom window. So please feel free to submit any questions, comments that you may have. But in the meantime, there was one question that stood out to me. And it's one that I've been kind of wondering myself, and it's that critical race theory has been around for a number of decades now. It's been in college classrooms, it's certainly been in law schools. Why only has it become so turbocharged now in these past few years? I'll give it up to Mr. Ruffo if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so why is there this kind of exponential growth? It's a hard question. There's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different hypotheses about this. Zach Goldberg, the academic, he has a theory that I find somewhat persuasive, that social media has increased the transmission speed of these ideas. I think it's also, in my view, you had the Trump years, and this was the main rhetorical tactic of the left. I mean, they've used it, against Reagan, against Bush. It's kind of a perpetual line of attack, but they developed this sophisticated vocabulary with critical race theory, with other disciplines, with other kind of political operations. And you see the numbers in the media. So if you look at New York Times or Washington Post or any of the kind of main print publications, you see kind of them steady, and then starting in the Obama years, and then really just going vertical during the Trump years. Systemic racism, whiteness, white privilege, white fragility, et cetera, become part of the common vocabulary, and they spread mimetically through society. And then you have these confirming events like George Floyd, where they've erected this intellectual framework, they've saturated the vocabulary and media with these concepts, and then they pull in these incidents or confirming events like George Floyd or any of the other events that you've seen that lead to these broader movements as kind of the igniting element or the inciting incident for broader social consequences. And I think those two things put together, also using the speed of social media, and frankly, it's the rhetoric is very effective. It's very powerful. It gives people a sense of who to hate, of who to blame, of who to despise, of who to rage against. And those things are very effective. They're very powerful. And I think really most importantly, institutions have developed no defense mechanisms against them, because people in powerful places will simply submit to it rather than push back against them. And they've constructed their arguments to really take root in institutions and then take over institutions.
Mr. Gottman, I know you talked a little bit about how you only found out about CRT through overhearing some things on your daughter's Zoom calls. And I was wondering, is it that factor? Do you think there are other factors at play in alarming parents?
No, let me correct that. That's how a lot of parents heard about it. We were different. And this is something I didn't mention. We were asked as parents, because my daughter's school went so far down this path, to do two things. One is to sign a pledge or community agreement at the beginning of the school year, which we were supposed to have signed before she entered school right around Labor Day last year, that said not only would we support these anti-racism initiatives in the school, but we would help teach them in the home. Okay, so we had to sign a pledge. We actually refused to sign it.
I'm sorry, did they say what these initiatives were, or was it open-ended like that?
They had communicated through the summer since the events of George Floyd what some of these were going to be, how they were going to incorporate this. Not a whole lot, again, no transparency. And then again on a Zoom call, I think there was a Zoom call right around the beginning of school about curriculum. Again, not a whole lot of transparency. But the second part of that answer to your question is not only do we have to we're supposed to sign that pledge, we had to do mandatory anti-racism training for parents. So we had to do 2 90-minute Zoom sessions hosted by these same consulting firms that do the in-school training for teachers and I think also for kids. So we actually, as parents at my daughter's school, got a firsthand taste of what this really was. Different than a whole lot of other parents that, like you said, did hear about some of these things just by overhearing their Zoom sessions. So different experience. They, because our school went so far.
Sure. That sort of lack of transparency is something that I know Mr. Rossi also touched upon in his letter when he talked about how he was asked to sign a contract renewing his term for the next year that stated a commitment to anti-racism training for the next year. Could you elaborate on what you've seen these take on, what shape you've seen these take on in the past? I know you didn't sign that for this upcoming year, Mr. Rossi, but what do you think it would have entailed for you?
Well, if I had to only speculate, and they wouldn't go into details on what it was, but essentially, by restorative justice, the implication is that I've harmed the community, and in that contract offer, they said that I had explicitly harmed students of color and other students at the school. All of my entreaties and questions to the administration about what was the nature of the harm that I caused were never answered. It was just a compounding in meetings that I repeated meetings with the administration that by questioning my own racial identity in a public forum and modeling for the children, basically that these were open to debate and these were open to question. That is, your socially imposed identity does not necessarily mean that you have to identify yourself in a particular way. That I had disturbed the racial identification of the students of color, because if a white identified student questions their own identity, well then it is two things. One, it's an abdication of responsibility in their eyes, and also it is a willful blindness towards the racial identification of others. As a colleague told me in a faculty meeting, he said, I do not believe that students who are white should be allowed to identify as anything other than white, because it will allow them to use the N-word with impunity and simply just deny that they're responsible for it, which is such a fascinating thing to me, because it's so interesting to me. How could someone believe that B followed from A? For example, you could still say that that's a terrible thing to do and it should not be allowed. Why would that be justified no matter how we racially identified? So I found really the cornerstone of this entire training and programming, which are interesting words that they use, is really around compelling vulnerable people, both employees in corporate environments, students, teachers, to adopt a certain racialized identity as a kind of operating system upon which they can run programs which push a certain moral superiority or moral depravity on you, depending on your group, the group that you're identified with. And what I found is that is really what they call identity work 101. That is, if you question the teaching on that level, you are a heretic. Like, you are really beyond, outside of the schema. And I think that's actually has showed a lot of promise when we get into discussing how to push back on some of these things at the individual level, because I think there is, and Chris can address this as far as the legal precedent for individuals that simply refuse as a matter of conscience to participate in this.
That makes sense. And that offers a great segue into our next topic. I know we've been talking a lot about CRT, what that looks like in theory, but on the ground, there's been a lot of state legislature bills, a lot of school board proposals to curtail or wind back some of the critical race theory teachings. And Chris, I wanted to ask you, there are many proposals under consideration at school boards and state legislatures. Which ones do you support? Which ones are a good role model for combating this theory of CRT?
Yeah, so this is a new a field of legislation. This is not something that legislatures have tackled before, but in very quick succession, really, I think as a surprise to many of us, we now have 9 states that have instituted through their boards of education or their state legislatures restrictions on this kind of pedagogy. Some of the bills are better than others. From my point of view, I think that the best model actually is from a colleague of mine named Jim Copeland at Manhattan Institute. He's put together amazing model legislation for states. I fully endorse it. I provided feedback on it based on my own work with state legislatures. I think that synthesizes the best aspects of a lot of different school districts, and it really relies on a couple different key principles. One is transparency. So in this model legislation, it would require public schools to post publicly on their websites all of their teaching materials and curriculum documents relating to sensitive issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, so that a parent knows exactly what's happening in the classroom. That's a parent's right, is to know what you're teaching their kids, especially in public education, where many students are frankly compelled to attend. Some students don't have any other options. And then the second is really restricting teachers from violating students' right to conscience or right against compelled speech. So you can teach about, obviously, the history of slavery, racism, and justice. That's something that I think is universally acknowledged as a public good, as an important part of an education. But what you can't do is compel students to believe in some very specific, and I think very nasty ideas, such as one race is superior to another, or one race is inherently oppressive or inherently oppressed and debilitated and incapable. So there are these kind of ugly racial generalizations that come up in CRT that these states and state legislatures are saying, you can't force students to believe, you can't teach as truth that, all people of a certain racial group are inherently oppressive, for one example. And I think that makes a lot of sense. These are, democratically accountable institutions, public schools funded by taxpayers, chartered by states, that people get a say. I mean, the public decides what happens within public institutions. And I think these bills, this legislation is a really good first shot, a really good first step in this process of trying to rein in some of these programs that in many cases were never approved by voters. They've been really snuck in the back door by consultants and bureaucrats. They transgressed the actual democratic will of the people. And then the people are really saying, you know what, we actually are the ultimate authority. We get to decide what you're teaching in the classroom.
Now, I know we also talked a little bit about how CRT teachings manifest themselves differently in public and private schools. And Mr. Gottman, I wanted to ask you specifically, because I know you've had a lot of conversations with parents. What sorts of advice would you offer parents who are seeing these curricula in their children's education? Is there a way that you would combat this at the private school level?
It's so much harder at the private school level than it is in public school for a number of reasons. You don't have some of the civil rights protections you do in a public institution. You don't have things like Freedom of Information Act requests where you can get the curriculum, and you can be kicked out of the school, or your kid can be kicked out of the school. So there is a absolute terror amongst parents of speaking up in the private school world that doesn't exist in the public school world, because the public schools can't kick your kid out. And so it has been incredibly difficult to get parents in private schools, especially in a place like New York City, to speak up. We did it. I could do it because professionally I wasn't cancelable, and because we had already decided to take our daughter out of the school. Parents are terrified of being canceled professionally. Parents are terrified of being, canceled socially. And the wealthier that they are, the more they are terrified, and the harder it is them to speak up. You'd think that, okay, these billionaire board members in New York City would be the ones that can say, hey, I got to say something, I've got to stop. No, they're the ones that are on the board the least likely to stand up to this and speak up. But we have to try. There are, some constituencies that have spoken up a little bit, not effectively. I mean, there have been battles won in the public school world, and we're seeing more and more of that. People getting on school boards, legislation at the state level. Very, very few, if any, battles being won in the private school world, unfortunately. And I thought, someone asked, I think in the question, well, what are the alternatives? There aren't any, or there are very, very few alternatives right now. All the private schools are basically using the same playbook because, as I think Paul had said earlier, a lot of it's coming down from the NEIS accreditation agency, the National Association of Independent Schools. Whether one school is maybe 6 or 9 or 12 months ahead or behind other schools, but they're all doing the same thing. Unless you go really very religious schools or homeschool, seem to be the only alternatives in sort of the private school world. But it's hard. But I tell parents, look, try to find out what's being taught. Again, if it's Zoom, you can overhear. If you look at the homework that your kid is getting now that hopefully schools are in person in most places. See what's going on, ask questions, talk to the administration, talk to the board, band together. There is strength in numbers. It's very lonely when you're the only one that is fighting this. You are not the only one that is upset about what is going on. There are many, many, many parents. I know parents fighting in pretty much every New York City private school. Nobody's been effective yet, which is why we have to band together and do this, not just at the per school level, but we've got to try to save, our kids, to save these institutions. So speak up. I know it's hard. I know there's the risk of being canceled. There's the risk of having your kid kicked out of school, but we've got to find some people with courage to speak up.
We have another audience question that I think plays very well into this discussion, but the question is, what motivation do private schools have to change their policies as long as these private schools remain scarce, coveted pipelines to elite colleges that parents worship? Mr. Rossi or Mr. Gottman, I know you both have been in the system, and I'd love to hear what you think, what sort of incentives these schools have.
None. It's money. Until enough parents, Paul can answer this, but until enough parents start pulling their kids out, and it's got to be a much bigger number. It is happening a little bit, and we're not the only ones. I mean, it is happening, but it's got to be a much bigger number, and you've got to have people stop donating. That is also happening. Donations for sure down at most of these schools, but not anywhere near the level that will effectuate change. I know, Paul, you have a...
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it it's accurate, and the answer is kind of embedded in the question. The thing that I've been on some calls that are DEI consultancies openly talking about how the boardroom is a scary place for DEI consultancies right now. But they are doing the math and they're saying, well, we need to, it may be fine to lose 20 parents. They're talking, numbers. They're saying, and we could lose 20 parents. Could we lose, 30 parents? Well, could we lose some donors? Yes. Well, we could find other donors, right, to replace them. So they're calculating on the cost of drawing a line in the sand. So it's definitely on the radar. But I think I agree with Andrew. You need 50, you need 60 parents, you need substantial blocks of parents to act. There was a survey that was done recently at Dwight Englewood School in New Jersey that where 72% of the parents were upset with the type of indoctrination that was going on there. So those are the kind of numbers that could really move the needle. But I think, in some cases, there are large foundations that will protect these brands, these very, elite brands that essentially are these schools. I don't know. There are large left liberal foundations that may save them. So I'm not exactly sure a donor strike would work. But I think it starts with the parents and the alumni.
I'll just add one quick thing, which is, what makes this even harder, and we're all here, I think, advocates for, diversity of thought in these schools. The people that are leaving mean that the people that are left or the people that are then incoming are of that same mindset. So it gets even that much harder to fight. And it gets even that, and that's what they want. I mean, they want to get people that have a different viewpoint out of these schools and bring in people that have the viewpoint that they share.
I think too, maybe part of it is that a lot of parents, at least in the reporting that I've done, people I've talked to, perceive, and rightly so, I mean, realistically, that being fluent in this vocabulary, being fluent in this language, being fluent in these rituals is really a requirement for access into elite, collegiate, and post-collegiate institutions. So if you want to be a Ivy Leaguer and then go to work at McKinsey after you graduate, this is now a kind of code language, regardless of your actual impact on helping impoverished people or underprivileged people or whatever the euphemism is of choice of the day. This is now a kind of elite vocabulary that you have to speak in order to get access to these institutions and opportunities. And a lot of parents in places like in LA or San Francisco, or I've been reporting Seattle even, their desire to have their kids get on that escalator outweighs their desire to speak out against it. And they may be making a calculation, well, if it's just me speaking out, I'm just gonna get roasted. So kind of just grin and bear it, maybe teach them at home, this is kind of BS, but just get them up and out. And I think that when I think of that is, I mean, it is what it is, right? It's easy to say, well, you're not courageous. We have Andrew and Paul both very courageously put themselves out there. But I think that you also have to apply it kind of in reverse to the theory. And one of the things that really I find egregious and just abominable about critical race theory is that the entire theory is derived to gain power within elite institutions since its founding at Harvard Law School in the late 1980s. It's all about how to gain power within elites. It's a kind of intra-elite power struggle, rather than actually providing any concrete benefit to people living in poverty or desperation in America's poorest places of any racial background. Critical race theorists seem surprisingly uninterested in actually doing the work of lifting people out of desperate circumstances. They're much more interested in securing their own status within institutions. And I find that just absolutely disgusting because they're using the poor and the oppressed who actually exist in our world as a kind of mascot and a kind of tool, as a kind of image or symbol for them to play their own games among people that all share privilege regardless of their racial background. That to me is one of the reasons why I think it's important to expose it and to fight against it.
Mr. Ruffo, I know you said on the argument with Jane Coaston that you thought these solutions were elite driven and elite serving. And I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about that because I know that the history of race in America is a very sensitive topic, and I was wondering what sort of solutions would you have for actually teaching these topics in the classroom, if not CRT? Is there a positive curriculum that to which you can point that you would have schools adopt across the country?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is, and I think it depends on what level, right? A first grader is going to be different than a 12th grader. I think by the time you're in high school, you're pretty sophisticated. You can show American history, difficult topics, policy debates from a variety of perspectives, and let kids really challenge themselves to be able to argue the best points of the other side, of their side, figuring out what they believe. But I think it's such a myth that somehow in the United States that we are hesitant to or refuse to teach about race or racial injustice in the classroom. I mean, if you go and you look at the actual textbooks dating back decades now, it seems like they get a lot of attention. I know in my public K through 12 education in California, we learned these issues, kind of backwards and forwards every day, every unit, all the time, which I think is good and fair and certainly, but also disproves this idea that somehow the United States doesn't want to have, a national conversation about race. It seems like that's the only national conversation we have to a large extent, which again, I think is fair and appropriate. But I think that what I've learned, and I'll draw on my experience as a documentary filmmaker. I directed a film for PBS, not exactly a right-wing broadcasting outlet, about three of America's poorest cities. And I spent multiple years living with and working with and speaking with and interviewing people in America's poorest zip codes, in predominantly white neighborhood, a predominantly Black neighborhood, and predominantly Latino, Asian, and multiracial neighborhood. And a lot of their struggles were very similar, and things that get absolutely no attention from something like CRT. It's things like the absolute devastation of families, of local communities, the kind of stripping of these communities of social capital, particularly through churches and faith-based institutions. And then, talking about class issues. So someone that is, growing up on the kind of south side or west side of Youngstown, Ohio, maybe in a predominantly white part of the town, they're facing these issues, kind of collapse of families. 3/4 of families are single parent, collapse of meaningful outlets for men. So the majority of men are unemployed, out of the labor force, suffering from high rates of drug addiction, alcohol abuse, violence, et cetera. These are the real issues that when you actually go into poor communities, that people talk about, that people are struggling with, that engage them in a deep emotional way. And yet these are things that you can't even talk about. They're tabooed in elite environments, and then completely turned on their heads by critical race theory, which, for example, argues that the family is a white supremacist patriarchal institution that should be dismantled. That entry-level work, which is, as we know from economics, the kind of beginning of the economic ladder for people that actually move up the economic ladder, that's capitalist exploitation, and people shouldn't be required or even asked to work or participate in the labor force under exploitative capitalism. And then, faith and local community institutions and churches are again seen as an impediment to state control and redistribution. So I think, and I've argued this in a paper for Heritage Foundation, that if critical race theory, even though they have scant public policy advice, it's kind of cartoon version of Marxist redistribution. Even if we take them at face value and we implemented the CRT policies, I think it would increase inequalities and increase particularly racial inequalities.
Mr. Gottman, Mr. Rossi, I'd love to hear what you have to add. I'd be curious, what are your thoughts?
I'd like to illustrate kind of what's wrong, but just an anecdote about a colleague of mine who, very well-meaning young person, starting out as a teacher, and at one of these sessions, these training sessions, he said, "Well, I acknowledge that America was founded on racist ideals," and he threw that off as a line which was for him perfunctory, and I questioned it. I said, "Hold up. It may be that America is hypocritical, and we have been hypocritical, and we have not lived up to those ideals. And those ideals are a challenge that we need to recognize that there has been progress made, but there was tremendous evil that was done. However, to throw the baby out with the bathwater because you didn't live up to the ideals, to say the ideals themselves are corrupt, that to me is a cynical notion at the heart of CRT and the way that it's taught and the effects of its teaching is that it teaches students that the ideals, which happen, in many ways happen to be founded by white men, are evil because they mask some power relationship. So there is a perfectly legitimate way to address the failings of our history and the failings of our present to live up to those ideals without trashing the ideals.
But as a follow-up, I'd like to ask, if you were building a curriculum from scratch on these topics, are there any thinkers or academics that you would include? I know in your letter you mentioned John McWhorter, but who are the speakers, the ideals that you'd like to see featured in a racial education, racial instruction?
Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, the great thinkers in the classical liberal tradition that affected real positive change in the civil rights movement. Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, all of the perspectives of that created the positive change in our country and the debates around the different approaches. I mean, that to me would be where you would go.
Mr. Gottman, I saw that you've been wanting to jump in, so I wanted to give you the floor.
Well, I like what Paul just said. I would just add that we have got to go back to teaching history, real history and civics, which is something that we have gotten away from in the last many decades. And we don't save our country unless we go back to teaching his real history, which I'm sorry to say is mostly Western civilization oriented classical history. Which is, again, not saying we don't teach slavery. There is no one in this movement that said, the anti-CRT movement that says we shouldn't teach slavery, we shouldn't teach Jim Crow. But you've got to go back and teach classical history. You've got to go back and teach founding principles of this country. You've got to go back and teach Enlightenment values. And we have gotten so far away from that, even before CRT became in the news in the events of George Floyd. But now we are even that much further from that now. And I'll just add one thing too. I think what both Paul and Chris said, even if this movement, the CRT movement, is well-meaning, let's say, like affirmative action probably was, and I don't think this movement is well-meaning, it is counterproductive, it is divisive, it will ultimately wind up, as Chris said, with more segregation effectively and inequality. So that's what I wanted to add.
Great. I wanted to go towards an audience question. There's a question from one of our audience members, which says, when some public school districts are blatantly confronted by parents if they teach CRT, the answer is always no, but it appears that's incrementally embedded in their other catchphrase curriculum, social emotional learning. How can parents review the curriculum then? Mr. Ruffo, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, again, it's kind of competing vocabularies, and oftentimes school teachers or school districts will deny that they're teaching critical race theory. Sometimes I think this is a deliberate kind of camouflaging or deliberate evasion. Although other times, look, public school teachers are not kind of experts in CRT. They might be teaching principles or concepts that derive from critical race theory without knowing what that is. So I think parents should have patience. They should have grace. They should give teachers and administrators the benefit of the doubt. But they should really drill into what does the curriculum teach, get the documents, ask them for the curriculum, ask them for the teaching materials, ask them for the training documents. And if they don't give them to you voluntarily, file a Freedom of Information request. And you'll see very quickly what it looks like. And parents, even parents who don't have a sophisticated understanding of the theory of critical race theory or all of the key terms or all of the key insights, haven't read the academic literature, they know in their hearts, in their gut, in their intuitive sense, if something is wrong, if something is harmful, if something is abusive. And so I would just say for parents to follow their instincts. Like, these are their children. Parents are by nature protective. And I think that if you sense something that even has a very smooth and euphemistic name like social emotional learning. Sounds great. Some of it is fine. Other kind of modules of social emotional learning are merely vehicles to launder in political activism. Parents should be, I think now more than ever, very aggressive in finding out what's being taught and finding out what's happening, because I've talked to too many parents in the last year that this has done a lot of damage to their kids. And the left media likes to portray this as kind of white parents complaining or being mad about it. But I spoke with, when I was in Arizona speaking to a group, an African-American father who said that the kind of Black History Month traumatized his kids, and his son, who was finishing elementary school, very outgoing, very sociable, very courageous, was just shattered and was asked to sleep in his parents' bed again. And then the father said, "What happened?" He said, "Dad, they're telling me that America is a white supremacist country, that I'm going to be hunted down and murdered by the police, that society is out to kill us and imprison us." And this father said, "That's complete nonsense," and actually, went to the school to kind of put a stop to it. But this stuff fuels all sorts of negative emotions. It really manipulates the kind of hearts and minds of kids and puts them towards these, I think, destructive ends. Parents should be really aware and really engaged in what's being taught.
Mr. Gottman, Mr. Rossi, do you agree with Mr. Rufo's take? Would you add anything? Any tips or tricks? Perhaps not tricks, but tips.
You want to go, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think for teachers being on the inside, they have a great chance to help parents and help groups organize, and even students. So, there are students came to me certainly that were bothered by certain things that they were being asked to believe unquestioningly, and so I tried to support them in ways that were keeping their minds open and without pushing my own beliefs, of course, but really trying to encourage them to speak up. I've been in touch with several students at the public schools, and we're going to be starting a student group through FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, to really encourage and get students to feel more confident in standing up and speaking from their conscience about questioning some of these things. For parents, you can, I had access to the content management system, so I had access to assignments and materials. I think teachers can make those things available to parent groups as a way to get the information to them, in the interest of transparency, like Chris was talking about. I've been in touch with principals. I've been in touch with superintendents that are bothered by this, that are on the verge of resigning because they can't go through with this. So there's a lot that can be done to help facilitate things from the inside.
I think it's gotten easier now for parents to recognize this because there are so many resources out there. You can kind of Google around. A lot of organizations have put together packets on, how to recognize CRT or social emotional learning in your kid's school. Also, the one thing we haven't really touched upon is sort of the anti-meritocratic aspect of this. So when you're seeing your school get rid of, different math groups, tracking type of programs, or getting rid of requirements in high school. I know there's someone told me one of the top high schools in New York City just went from, I think, a 4-year math requirement to a 2-year math requirement. And that's, things like that are becoming more obvious for parents to recognize. So I do think that's getting easier. And the fact that there are so many parents now that are talking about this, that wasn't the case, 6 or 12 months ago.
I wanted to hone in on that attention that's been given to this issue, because there's been a lot of talk, a lot of different policy proposals out there. I wanted to ask if you thought any of them went too far, if there are any proposals that you think may be doing more harm than good, as well-intentioned as they may be. I don't know whether that could take the form of legislation or something else, but there's a question about the conservative backlash. And Mr. Rossi, I see that you're typing an answer to that, but I wanted to ask you, what sorts of things would you not agree with? What sorts of things would be counterproductive in this fight?
My general approach is that I think that focusing on the divisive practices, the things that is, in my understanding, limited legal understanding, violate the 14th First Amendment and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Those things I think are totally okay. Content and banning content at the content level is to an extent also understandable, but with certain things, and I don't know the statutes, but I can't quote them, but things that actually ban the teaching of the 1619 Project, I think that those are going too far.
I mean, Chris can speak about this a lot more than I can, but the language is too broad. It just is too easy to attack. I know Chris I think has had experiences like that. The one thing I really don't like, and I remember hearing the state was doing this, and I don't remember if it was in the legislation, was cameras in the classroom. I really dislike the idea of cameras in the classroom. Maybe, as a teacher, I'm guessing, Paul, what you would say about it, but I get it. You want to say, okay, now there's full transparency because we're seeing what our teachers are teaching, but I think that actually makes it even that much more difficult for anybody, student or teacher, to be able to speak freely. So that's one thing that I think goes way too far. But I think on the legislation, it's got to be, language has to be careful. It's got to be, broad enough to be effective, but narrow enough where it isn't too easy to attack, for any reason.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think some of the legislation is stronger than others, depends on the state. I think all the legislation is good, though. It's a step forward, and legislation can always be revised. I think that the Manhattan Institute, my colleague Jim Copeland, has put out what I think is the gold standard for this model legislation on critical race theory, transparency, accountability, protection of conscience. Those are the kind of three key principles or pillars of this. The cameras in the classroom, I remember that was kind of a social media thing that kind of popped around for a little while. I haven't seen any actual proposals. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's ever been proposed anywhere. Maybe it's more of a kind of debating tactic to outflank them on the right, and then the legislation seems more reasonable. I support it in that case, I guess. I think, I had a parent ask me at an event, say, I want cameras in the classrooms. What do you think? And I said, you know what? If you think that you cannot trust the teachers of your kids to the point where you want to monitor them, every minute of the day via a kind of CCTV, like in a prison environment, you should probably take your kids out of that school immediately and find a different public school, a different city, a different town, a private school, religious school. And I think that good teaching and good institutions rely on trust. And the cameras in the classrooms, to me, is really not a serious policy proposal so much as it is a symptom that the trust with many parents has been very deeply broken. And my view is that it's incumbent on the institutions, on the public schools, to work to rebuild that trust with their constituents, with the people who pay the bills, with the people who provide the funding and the authority to these institutions. So I think that's good. I think that's really the way to go. And in my view, the long-term solution is more choice. I think every family has the right to choose the best education for their child. I would love to see more competition, more choice, more opportunity, so that if your kid is stuck in a dysfunctional public school, and that you as a parent have the option to take that money and apply it somewhere else, I think would not only help many parents who feel trapped, but it would also help the overall system of education in the United States.
In the public school environment, Mr. Ruffo, you've been criticized by a number of conservative commentators, namely David French, on the grounds that a lot of these state prohibitions of CRT infringe upon constitutional protections of free speech. And I was kind of wondering, how would you respond to these criticisms that these are unconstitutional under the First Amendment? And you mentioned freedom of conscience. Do you think that some of this legislation is redundant with our current First Amendment protections protecting against compelled speech and other freedom of conscience?
No, none of it's redundant, right? Because this is a new problem with new institutions that requires very specific legislation. And the proof is already there, right? Because teachers are teaching this, public schools are engaging in these practices. And if they were very clearly a violation of the law, they wouldn't be doing it. Their attorneys and legal counsel would say, you have to stop doing this. They think, the public schools think that it is legal. They think that they can do it. And it's up to legislators to make a clear line, to say, nope, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. That's the responsibility and I think the moral obligation of legislators. And then regarding the conservative critics, I think, many people would maybe say, I don't know, maybe David French is not a conservative. That's kind of an open question. But I think French's own position is borderline incoherent. Months ago, when I cornered him on it in a conversation with Barry Weiss, he said that he liked the legislation in Idaho. He said that was actually very good. He approved of it. Then he seemed to be very upset about other legislation. He actually lied about the bill in Tennessee. He actually misrepresented the bill entirely, which for a Harvard-educated lawyer, I give him the benefit of the doubt that he's smart. So he must have, done that with some knowledge. And then most recently, he actually endorsed the Manhattan Institute model legislation that I, support and helped on. He said, yeah, this is great. This should be the gold standard. So it's kind of a dartboard. Every time, every take is quite different. But I think that even in kind of French's world, he supports it. And there are also many legal scholars with kind of a greater pedigree than David French that actually think that all of these bills are constitutional. So the courts will ultimately decide. It's not up to me. It's not up to David or any of us here. It's really up to the courts. And I think that what will happen is that if the courts decide that some or certain provisions have to be revised, they'll get revised. But the most important thing is not to kind of retreat to a technical debate. It's really a debate about principles. What do we want the public education to look like? Who holds ultimate authority? And on those questions, I think we're 100% in the right.
I know I was just for a little bit of specifics, one of the audience members mentioned the book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1960 to 1840. And I kind of wanted to ask you about some law professors, some legal scholars who do believe that this legislation is constitutional and believe that they are necessary for the preservation of American education. Could you point us to a couple of them?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch the last part.
You mentioned that you knew of a couple legal scholars who thought that these bills were perfectly A-OK under the First Amendment. And I was just wondering if you could point us towards a few names, a few articles that you think might be good for us to read.
Yeah, sure. The guys at Legal Insurrection have written a lot about this. Hans Bader has written a lot about this, specifically some of the legislative pieces. The Attorney General of Montana wrote an amazing, I think, 25-page report looking at critical race theory in the classroom, looking at some of the constitutional issues. There's a huge range, but I think that the really strange point, and from a non-lawyer's perspective, seems quite obvious, and it's been reiterated by many attorneys and legal scholars, is that the public gets to decide what's taught in public schools. It's not really it's not any more complicated than that. And I think that the idea that somehow we have to cede our authority as voters, as a public in our democratic system, that we have to cede authority to anti-racism bureaucrats and departments of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we just have to follow whatever their program is because it's based on the latest fads coming from academia, is so boneheaded. It's so antithetical to the spirit and the letter of the Constitution and the Declaration, and then just so corrosive to our own independence and autonomy as citizens, that I think it's really astonishing that could even be advanced in a serious way. I think it shows just how much authority that we've lost as people, as citizens, as voters. And I hope that this is an issue, ultimately not about CRT or no CRT. CRT to me is important, but it's not the be all and end all. It's really about who has authority in a republic, who has authority in our system. Is it experts and academics and bureaucrats, or is it the people, the voters, and state legislatures? That to me is the key decision, the key question. And I think that if we have any democratic spirit left in us, legislators are going to start exercising their rightful power and making sure that public institutions serve the public first and reflect the values of citizens and voters.
I have a question.
Can
I ask a question?
Yeah, no, go for it.
I have a question for Chris.
Flipping the tables.
I sort of follow up on the David French, but I mean, my experience has been that it is so hard to get sort of the center left to speak up on this issue of CRT because they are either terrified of being called a racist or being called a conservative. And even if they fundamentally, agree with the position that CRT is divisive and toxic and bad, they really won't speak up on this. I'm curious, is that your experience? And I'm guessing it is. Do you have any thoughts on how you get the center left to become part of this fight, or do you think it's not necessary for them to become part of this fight to win it? I'm just sort of curious. Sorry to Kevin.
To me?
Well, the question was to Chris. Yeah, sorry. I apologize to Kevin for taking over this.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard. It's very hard because it's the very nature of the structure, right? Where going against critical race theory is pretty easy if you're in a suburban neighborhood in Kansas. It's very difficult, kind of culturally, socially, professionally, if you are in a neighborhood in Brooklyn or the hills of Berkeley, California. The social pressures are so different that it's very hard for someone who's center left or classical liberal or libertarian to actually stake a claim. I know what that's like. I've had that experience. And I think there are really two answers. I think you have to bifurcate and separate the playing fields. And there's one playing field where it's very easy to get victories. We racked up victories from New Hampshire to Texas to Florida to Oklahoma to Idaho, et cetera. That's fun. I enjoy playing in that kind of playing field. I enjoy getting wins there. It's a different playing field and a different strategy in elite enclaves in major American cities. It's just different. And I think it will require different tactics, different strategies, different coalitions. But I think that there's two things that I'm optimistic about even in those fights. And one is that this really is a kind of broad political group. You have 72% of independents in the United States oppose critical race theory in the classroom. So that's a lot of your kind of center left voters. And you have, at the two schools that both of you are affiliated with, you have schools in LA and San Francisco where these big fights, they're trying to recall the school board in San Francisco for being too kind of crazy on this stuff. So the center left is waking up. We see that happening very strongly all over. And I think that there's going to be a point where there's enough numbers where people feel safe to express their own views. I think we're already seeing that in San Francisco. And then I think that the other thing is that this is truly a multiracial coalition. Some of the strongest opponents and most successful opponents, frankly, against these policies in classrooms have been from the Asian American community, from kind of Bay Area of California to suburban Virginia. They've been leading the fight. And you have now growing numbers of African American parents, Latino parents that are joining this coalition. So the support is deepest among conservatives. I think that's obvious. But I think the breadth of the support is expanding, especially as people start feeling the impact of this. And this theory is a solvent. It dissolves institutions. It dissolves excellence. It dissolves accomplishment. It dissolves merit. And people are starting to say, wait a minute, you had me on racial justice. We want that. But the specifics, now that I'm seeing what you're teaching and what you're doing to our institutions, I don't want it. And I think that's the kind of awakening that I'm seeing.
I want to take this opportunity because I know, Mr. Gottman, you talked about not being cancelable earlier, and your last question just hinted at the elite culture around this. And fusing a couple questions that have talked about cancel culture, have talked about this sort of woke capital sort of outcry that we've seen in the past few months. How big of an issue do you think corporate support or complacency with CRT is? Do you think that there are strategies, whether it be boycotts or corporate sanction of CRT, will do anything at this level? Or is it something where the fear is so pervasive that there's not much ability to push back, whether you're in the center left or the left in general?
That's me?
Go for it.
That's a problem. I mean, I've said this a lot. We don't solve the education issue broadly until we solve the cancel culture issue. Especially in the private school world and in the university world. Chris is breaking news every day about, I think he just did that right before we got on, about what's going on in the corporate world, how woke these corporations have become, and therefore how scared people are that work for those corporations or even deal with them in any respect to speak freely. I mean, this is an enormous problem. How do you solve that problem? I don't think anybody has the answer. Exposing them is clearly number one. Shaming them, obviously, number two. I think I've suggested boycotts, and I've talked to a lot of people. I mean, they don't seem to be all that effective. I mean, it's awfully hard to say, let's go boycott Google, or let's go boycott Nike or American Express, or there's such corporate, there's consolidation in every industry over the last however many years. There aren't that many companies left if you want to boycott. One of the leaders of this fight, one of the big organizations that has grassroots chapters, was saying, I got to get my kid baseball pants, and I really want to avoid Nike, but they're the best. We really have no choice. So, it's hard. I don't think anybody knows. I'd be very curious if Paul and Chris has any thoughts on how we actually solve this in the corporate world, other than just continue, as Chris is doing, to expose, and hope that there's some shaming that ultimately reverses itself. I think we need to go after the CEOs. I'll add that, and shame the CEOs. I wanted to do a big PR campaign, and I got to raise some money to do it, and really say, listen, you got to go after the leadership, the cowardly leadership here, and maybe that'll have some effect. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think if you're going to try the boycott strategy, you just have to make it perfectly clear why you're boycotting. I think you have to say it has to be public. There have to be sympathetic media outlets that are going to, convey that story, and to be explicit about, what it is in the trainings that's causing you to do that.
The corporate stuff is tough. Corporations are kind of like private schools in that way, where the public doesn't have direct leverage, direct control, direct influence. They can't simply rally their legislators to change it. They can't run for school board. They can't, get the community together to run for CEO of Apple. So they're insulated from this. Although I would say on the positive side, in my reporting and reporting of some of my colleagues, we've had some victories. I think Coca-Cola kind of ditched their program when they were teaching employees to, quote, be less white. I'm not sure how you do that, but they were trying to go for that. And Disney, after I exposed their program, they actually nuked it from their internal servers. I think has come back since then, but they've modified it. They've toned it way down. They've taken away some of the egregious stuff. So I think that there is the public, and public sentiment and public exposure can provide another side of the incentive and decision-making process. Most CEOs are not like radical kind of gender studies ideologues. They simply hear from HR and marketing and their PR firms, you got to do this thing. We'll hire a consultant to do this. It's important. We need to kind of cover our bases, and they'll approve it. But they don't hear from the other side of who it might alienate, how extreme it might be, employees that might feel targeted or harassed or abused. So creating a full spectrum of opinion in the ears of CEOs and executives, creating a check on the other side, I think could be really helpful. And ultimately, I'm less worried about the corporations, because corporations are cynical creatures by design. And if the winds change, if the incentives shift, they'll abandon these things as fast as they adopted them. I think, again, the schools have the most potential influence, the most potential to cause harm. And I think that's where and also where we have most leverage as citizens. So I think that's the fight, that's the focus. I'm having fun exposing these companies, but I think I think if you shift the foundation, the companies will shift on top just naturally.
I just said the asset managers also are a problem, because they're driving some of this.
Yeah, managers. Yeah, and I think the data is in. I think Sam Goldman had a piece out yesterday or today saying, you have younger people coming into the workforce. You have departments like human resources that are dominated now. Kind of the tone is dominated by millennials, and by millennial women in particular, who are much more kind of progressive socially on these issues than even millennial men. I think that's it. And I think, again, the problem is that you only need a few people to say, we need to do this. You have a dictatorship of the most intolerant ideological minority where they can say, we need to have a white privilege training. And if you take that to your white male manager or C-level executive at company X, Y, and Z, is he really going to say, you know what, we really don't need to do the white privilege training. I'm going to go and deny that. These guys are picking their battles. They're going to say, all right, fine, do it. And we'll sit for it for 2 hours and then move on. So I think that a lot of this stuff is really internal stakeholders and leaders haven't developed the vocabulary, the courage, the strategies to push back against it. And I think hopefully as it gets more out there, they will.
I was actually referring to the asset managers, but that's a great point, which is we've seen this in schools. I'm sure Paul, you could speak to this. Almost any teacher under 35 has been trained in this through the teachers' colleges. So even if this isn't coming top down, it's the same thing at the corporate level. This is coming bottom up. That's a longer problem of how you either change. We need teachers' colleges or how you indoctrinate these, like you said, a lot of millennial women, but a lot of problems to deal with.
One strategy that I know many DEI consultancies use when they want to get into an institution, an educational institution, private institutions, they'll do a presentation for the board, which is very watered down, anodyne, and essentially soft pedals what they're actually going to push once they get in. And so exposing this in other institutions, you find the name of the organization that is being hired as a consultant, do some research, go to the other places, talk to other parents, find out, what are the dissertations that these consultants have published? What are they actually saying? What are the materials they've distributed at other schools? Getting those in front of the parents and say, listen, or the board members and say, listen, here's what this is really about. Do you really want this taught in the school? Again, you have, there's a whole vertical power structure here with NAIS and accreditation, but at least, it couldn't hurt, and it might change some minds of stakeholders.
So I know we're coming up on the end of this event, and one thing I wanted to ask as a final question, perhaps, is what sort of we're fortunate to be joined by members of school boards, parents, teachers, hopefully some students. I'm sure some students as well. And I wanted to ask you, what are the resources to which you would direct the people in the audience to learn more, to understand better what it is that they're dealing with? Are there websites, organizations, books even that you would say are good to look at to learn more about CRT? Perhaps we could start with Mr. Ruffo and go in the same order that we did.
Sure. Yeah. I've actually, this question has been asked of me many times. So what I did a number of months ago that I think has been really helpful to a lot of parents and policymakers and researchers, reporters, I put together a briefing book on critical race theory. If you just search my name, Christopher Ruffo, CRT briefing book, if you put that into Google, you'll find it. And it really has definitions, source quotations, stories that I've published, giving kind of evidence that demonstrates the harm or what's happening. And then also language. So giving parents, for example, language to use that's successful in fighting back against this, because a lot of this is a kind of language game or a language war. And then also model legislation, legal opinions, et cetera. That is kind of a full resource book for folks. So that's all of the stuff that I've done on this issue kind of in one place, the CRT briefing book. And it's free and open to access.
Mr. Gottman.
Let Paul go because he's with a number of organizations. Maybe he wants to.
Sure. Yeah, I'm volunteering with several different organizations. I think Chris's briefing book is great, and that's a great one-stop place to find a lot of things. I'm working with FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. They have a website that's recently launched called fairtransparency.org, where you can input data and basically rate your institution K through 12. There's also the Educational Liberty Alliance, edlibertyall.org. Parents Unite, parentsunite.org is having a conference in Boston, October 1st and 2nd. They have a lot of great resources there. So, counterweight.org is a great place. The ILV, the Institute for Liberal Values. There are so many, there's different places to go. I would recommend Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose is an excellent book that explains, over the past century, really, the origins of postmodernism and critical race theory and how they merged in Marxism and how they sort of created this particular strain and the various vectors of these ideas. It's a fascinating read, and it connected the dots for me.
And I'll just add, there's a number of organizations that have propped up recently, or in the last 6 months or so, that have local chapters all over the country. No Left Turn in Education. There's Moms for Liberty. FAIR has local chapters. I'm sure there are others. So there's a lot of resources out there, both in terms of information and in terms of helping parents get together and fight, especially in the public school realm.
Great. Well, with that, we'll wrap this event up because we're running out of time. But thank you so much to all of our guests for taking the time to speak to the Buckley program. And thank you to all of our audience members for their valuable questions. Have a good evening, everyone.